What's up, guys? Look what I got here. This is the Morales BTS street frame. And back in the day, this was one of the biggest, baddest, beefiest BMX frames you could buy. And today, we're gonna go over some of the quirks and features of this BMX frame. Then I'm gonna get it out on the road. No, I'm not gonna get it out on the road. Let me give you a little bit of history on this frame. So this is my personal frame. This was the very first freestyle frame that I ever purchased. Before this, all I rode was race bikes. So 97 was about the time I stopped racing BMX and was getting heavy into dirt jumping, discovering ramp riding and all that type of stuff. So I wanted a street bike. And in that era, the fatter the frame and the heavier the frame, that was the metric that we used to determine if a frame was strong or not. So we would just look at how fat the tubes were, what the weight of the frame was, and that is how we knew that frame was gonna be tough. Of course, other notable frames of that era were the standard lengthy, the standard STA, S&M had their own beefy frames. They had the Heavy as Fuck, the menstrual cycle, and then in this era that this frame came out, they had the S&M Sabbath, which is also one of my favorite bikes of all time. We'll get into my Sabbath build in the future. But this bike, man, talk about memories, man. This is the bike or this is the frame that I rode when I learned pretty much the majority of what I know about freestyle riding. Learned how to grind on this frame and 180s and 360s, all that stuff, learned right here on this frame. A little bit of backstory about Morales Bikes. So Morales Bikes was founded in '92 by Bob Morales, headquartered out in Fountain Valley, California. It wasn't until '94 that the company really took off with their first flatland frame. And this bike, according to the Morales website, wasn't introduced until '98, '99. However, I know for a fact I bought this frame no later than '98. In fact, I thought I originally purchased this frame in '97, which I think is plausible. I was actually going through an old issue of Ride magazine and came across one of their little like news updates, and it made mention that Morales Bikes was developing a frame in collaboration with the Gons, who at the time was every street rider's favorite street rider. That's the only mention I ever saw of Morales Bike Company being involved with the Gons. Don't know if he had any input on this frame or not. I'm assuming not. Otherwise, we probably would have heard about it. We probably would have seen the Gons riding one of these or representing it in some capacity. Either way, awesome bike. So it was kind of a short-lived success for this bike here. And by '99, I believe, or 2000, Morales was just about done as a company, and they ended up selling off the remaining production of these bikes to Dan's Competition. And at the time, they already were on a second revision of this bike that did not have the integrated peg bosses, and a few other minor changes. I don't believe it had the Morales stamped cable guide that this one has, nor did it have the integrated gyro tabs. But it kind of bummed me out, because when I bought this bike, it was well over 300 bucks. It's an American-made frame, of course, 4130 chromoly, the whole, all the things you'd want back in the day in a good frame, or even today. But when Dan's Comp got them, they sold them under their Poverty brand. And I knew it was a Morales BTS. I didn't know they actually came from Morales and they were still a US built frame, but they were blowing those things out for like 99 bucks. So, you know, here I was rocking this bad boy, which, you know, I was proud of, but it just cheapened the whole experience. It wasn't long after that that I tore this thing down, and I believe my next purchase was a Hoffman Condor. So there's a little bit of background about the Morales brand and this BTS frame. By the way, what does BTS stand for, you might be wondering? Well, according to Morales, according to what I found, better than sex, which is not what I thought it stood for. In fact, both me and a friend of mine who also owned one of these, we both believed it stood for beefier than shit or burlier than shit. And I'm not sure where we both came to that conclusion because we did exclusively on our own. My other theory is it might be a little bit of a jab at Standard, who at the time had the frame the STA, which was stronger than all. So my guess was perhaps they meant to say better than Standard or beefier than Standard, something along those lines. I guess my last assumption would be maybe it stands for big tough street or something along those lines. I'm curious, is it better than sex? Maybe. That's not what I'm curious about. Fuck. What I mean is I'm curious to know what you guys think. Do you know what BTS stood for, or do you have any good guesses? Let me know in the comments below. All right, moving on. All right, so the most obvious thing is how fat this bike is. So this is a 2-inch top and down tube. One of the most unique features of this bike is the lower wishbone, which actually has the lower down tube swinging underneath the bottom bracket. Of course, you got the upper wishbone with the pierced seat tube here. So you have a double wishbone junction, and in the mid-school heyday, anything with a wishbone on it was new tech for frames, and that was like the coolest thing to have. So for this thing to have two big 2-inch wishbones built into it via pierced top tube and that guy right there, it was a pretty cool design. These chainstays are 1 inch thick. Most frames nowadays, it's like 3/4. Some of them taper down even narrower. This is 1 inch thick chainstay and seat stay. And because they're so thick, they actually had to indent the chainstays so that the crank arm would clear. Kind of standard for a lot of frames back then. They had really beefy chainstays on them and these wishbone type junctions. You can see the little indentation they put right here on the chainstay. That was so that you could clear your sprocket, because back then we were still running 44 tooth sprockets. Now the other interesting feature about this bike is this right here. These are integrated peg bosses, and you can see the little groove they have built into it, and that's so you could run your anti-spin pins. And you can see how well worn down they are on this frame, smashed down a little bit. Another cool little feature is the back side of these peg bosses. So right here you have like these flats, and that would actually hold the head of the bolt that you could run through the back side into your peg, so that it would keep the bolt from spinning when you tighten down the peg. So that was a really cool feature and touch that they did on these frames. Now, the geometry on these frames, I didn't know anything about geometry at the time. I was coming off of race frames, and this thing was totally foreign to me. This only has a 19 3/4 inch top tube on it, so it's a really short frame up top, but the rear end, being that they had to build it long enough to clear a 44 tooth sprocket, and they had such beefy junctions over here, this is a 15-inch chainstay center to center. It just wasn't working for me, so I actually went in with the grinder here and milled out the dropout, which originally stopped right there, 14 mil slots, and I ground out another inch worth of 3/8 slot right here into the dropout. Now, in order for me to run my wheel, I needed to run a 3/8 axle, which kind of sucked at the time, but not a big deal since I had the peg bosses. But I couldn't use an axle nut, so I actually had to run the Primo Jewels. If anybody from the mid-school remembers, those were like these cool little axle nuts that were basically, they would just go right onto the end of a socket. And so I'd run the Primo Jewels on there. I actually had to grind down some of the seat stay to clear that. Had to grind down a little bit off the top of the peg boss there. But it worked, and I believe my wheel slammed was, at around 13 and maybe 5/8, something like that, say around 14 inches. The other problem, though, is running the wheel that short is I didn't have enough clearance before the tire hit this guy. So on this particular build, I was actually running a 1.5 inch tire, which was super narrow. It was made by Primo. It was called the Ninja. It was like a complete slick. Now the other interesting thing about this frame is the diameter of this seat tube. This seat tube, I believe, is a 31.6, something like that. And so to run a standard BMX 25.4 or 22.2 seat post, you actually had to run this shim. So the tubing is not that thick. That's actually an aluminum insert that slides right into the frame. And it has the same thing going on up here at the head tube. So this head tube is actually 1.25 inches. And so to run a 1 inch, which was still common in that era, or 1 1/8 inches, you had to run these shims. So once again, the head tube is not that thick. That's actually an aluminum insert. And because it was 1.25 inches, they actually had to run integrated gyro tabs. As you can see, these are just little steel plates stamped onto there or welded onto there. This is the first frame I ever saw with the integrated gyro tabs, and pretty cool design. So yeah. Now surprisingly, despite this bike being so big and overbuilt and heavy, everything we thought made a strong bike, it actually had its issues. In fact, the first run of these, which I believe this frame is from, was subject to some type of recall or cease in production because of issues it was experiencing. This frame weighs just shy of 9 pounds without the shims or anything on it. As this thing sits right here is over 9 pounds. But the head tube is very thin. Rather than have the 1.25 inch head tube and rely on a shim to shim it down, they really should have just machined a head tube that was much thicker, that was a standard 1 1/8 inner diameter. I never had issues with my head tube flaring or getting wallowed out, but my friend that ran this frame did. In fact, I remember him having a big hose clamp kind of securing the front of the frame. Eventually it developed a crack. He ran that hose clamp on there for probably a year before he finally had to give up on it. The other issue that I had was with these peg bosses. So I was running the Primo Stiffy peg, which was a 5-inch peg. And it just put a tremendous amount of leverage on these peg bosses and the way they're designed, the way they're mounted to the frame. And given the fact that I ground out so much of the dropout, there just wasn't anything to support the twist of the peg. So after a few sessions, my pegs would slowly start twisting upward. And then I have to find some type of pipe or a hole in the ground or something to jam the peg into, pull on the whole frame and bring them back to flat and level. They actually look pretty level right now, so it might kind of work if I was to rebuild this bike. So yeah, those are kind of some interesting things worth noting. What else? As you can see, I put this frame through hell. I put a beating on this frame. I thank this frame for having taught me so much. I learned to grind on this thing and 180 and 360 and basically build all the fundamentals as a freestyle rider. Here's a cool little shot of the riveted on Morales brake stop cable guide. Now what I am missing on this frame is the plastic cable guides. Those would have been right here. And of course the original decals are gone. Now surprisingly, before I did this little video, I was doing some research and discovered that Morales actually re-released this frame in 2003 with some updated geometry with a 21-inch top tube. So I thought that was pretty cool. And that's basically it. You know, I dug this thing out of the closet earlier. Just thought I'd share it with you guys. Hopefully you find these mid-school bikes as cool as I do. And that's about it. I think I've covered all the bases. I appreciate you guys watching. I will see you later.